Hey, what's up? Patrick here with the very first episode of Green'dOut, a new series where we tell you a story about a time we consumed just a little too much THC. To set the stage, I had just moved from Houston to Denver and it was still my first couple months here in town. I had been smoking weed for a couple years, but it had primarily been flower as I didn't have access to concentrates in Texas. And through that flower, it was really what I would call the Rio Grande special, so definitely not the potent stuff that you can find in the legal market here in Colorado. Once I moved here, it became very clear that kind of dabs were the wave and everybody was consuming concentrates. And so I jumped on board, but didn't really realize that dabs and flower have very different potencies, especially if you start stacking them on top of each other. The night in question was a Friday, so everybody was meeting at a friend's apartment after work, and then we were all going to head over to this kick-ass ramen spot called Uncle here in Denver. Uncle doesn't take reservations, and so the people whose apartment it was ran over there right at 5 o'clock when they opened, or before then, put our names on the list, and then it was just a lottery of whenever you get in, they'll give you a call. When you get that call, you have 15 minutes to get there, and given that the apartment was about 10 minutes away from the restaurant, that did not leave a lot of time for dabs. So everybody finishes work and we're hanging out at the apartment just waiting for the restaurant to call and tell us our table's ready. Without really thinking about tolerance or dosage, I go ahead and dive in and take a small dab, thinking I can take another small one before we head out. I really don't have a tolerance acclimated to quality white market hash, and so this ends up being my first fatal flaw. But I take my dab and we're all hanging out in the living room having a great time. So after hanging out for a bit, we get the call from the restaurant and we have to be there in 15 minutes to get our table. We line up for a quick aperitif dab, pile into the car and head over. During the car ride, I can kind of feel the sweat starting on my brow, and I know that I'm in for more than I bargained for, but I'm just struggling to kind of pay attention, be in the conversation, and trying to ignore what I know is coming. So we get to the restaurant, we walk up, they immediately seat us. As soon as I'm seated, it becomes very clear that I am no longer able to withstand what is coming, and the tsunami of highness just hits me as soon as I sit down at the table. I remember I had a white plate in front of me, and the only thing I could do to maintain my sanity was stare a hole in that white plate. And by staring at that plate, that is the only thing that can keep me from sliding off the face of the earth. So I just sit there very intently focused at that plate and kind of ignore all the noise and everything that's happening around me. I distinctly remember the period between when we were seated and when our appetizers showed up as being the most unappealing. Luckily, I did have access to water, which I would say is tip number one if you ever find yourself in a similar scenario. Water is your friend, especially cold water can help bring you back to reality. But where I was at the moment, water was not cutting it. And so as we sit there and have conversations and I'm sipping some water, realistically, I'm not part of the activities. So I can only imagine what the table that was sitting next to us, what it must have looked like from their perspective. Because there's 4 people just sitting, having a normal conversation, enjoying drinks, enjoying the meal, and one absolute zombie just staring at his plate, not reacting to anything. So after suffering for a bit longer, I cannot tell you my excitement when our appetizers came out. I remember we got a variety of different types of bao buns. There was soft shell crab, there was eggplant, there's a pork belly, and as soon as those hit the table, for me, it felt like I was going to be okay. I remember biting into the first one and like literally my head exploded with more flavor than I could imagine, but in the process also kind of brought me back from the edge and made me a little more able to interact in the real world. And so tip number 2, if you ever find yourself in this scenario, definitely food helps. And it's also, food is outstanding when you're high, so it's really a win-win scenario. But water and food were the main things that helped me come back from what happened this day. So I took another bite, and I remember looking up at my friends, and I asked one of them, how their drink was, and they all just busted up laughing because I'm basically now getting caught up on the conversation that happened 20 minutes ago. But at least I was at the table now. I'm part of the dinner. Now, in my opinion, the really beautiful thing about getting way too high is that the down ramp can be quite pleasant. Once you get yourself back on Earth out of the atmosphere, whatever it may be, once you find yourself planted back on Earth, then you are all of a sudden in just a very, very high state that to people with higher tolerances now can be actually pretty hard to attain. And so that gentle ramp down from being way too high to being comfortably high coincided with the meal beautifully. I remember eating the super rich pork ramen and being at just the perfect state of toasty to like really enjoy everything that was happening there. And then the more food I ate, the more I sobered up, and it was this beautiful balance through the meal to where by the end I was a functioning adult who could laugh at myself for where I had been at the beginning. So that is my story of one time that I ingested more than a little bit too much THC and found myself in a pretty interesting position. Ultimately, this is one of the reasons we love THC so much, is you can overindulge from time to time, and ultimately the biggest threat is to your fridge and pantry. So thanks so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this story. If you guys have a Green'dOut story, definitely leave a comment. We want to hear about it, and hopefully we can bring you some funny ones in the future. Have a good one. Happy smoking.